Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on creating trauma-sensitive classrooms. I'm Barbara Sorrells, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Childhood Education and also the Director of Learning Together Through Purposeful Play, which is a therapeutic preschool program for children with a history of significant trauma. Before we get started, I'd like to encourage you to attend the Professional Learning Institute this summer that will be held in Austin. I'll be presenting a session on the impact of trauma on healthy growth and development and sharing the strategies and information that we have learned from our program and the children that we serve. I'd like to thank all of the early childhood educators who have joined us on this webinar. We know that you are very busy professionals, and we deeply appreciate that you have chosen to spend some time with us. I'm excited to share that over 2,000 people have signed up to deepen their knowledge of creating trauma-sensitive classrooms. And I believe that there has been such an overwhelming response to this webinar for many reasons. We are seeing an increasing number of children across the country who have experienced traumatic life events, and the adaptive survival strategies that they develop to cope with these difficult life experiences often interfere with their ability to enjoy play, learning, and relationships in the early childhood environment. And so as early childhood professionals, we are often the first responders, being in a very unique position to identify children who need an additional level of nurture and intervention to set them on a positive trajectory. Finally, we are very fortunate to have Katie Statman-Weil presenting today. Katie is an adjunct professor at Portland State University, where her courses focus on equity and guidance strategies that improve social and emotional development and self-regulation for all learners. She consults and speaks on the topic of early childhood trauma, challenging behaviors, and mental health nationally and internationally. Katie is also a foster parent for children who are involved with the child welfare system, and we look forward to her presentation this afternoon. After the webinar, we will have time for questions. Before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping details. If you do have questions that you would like to ask during the presentation, please write them in the question box on the lower left side of your screen. Katie will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Some people using a telephone line may experience a slight delay. You will have the best experience using the sound on your computer. So now we are ready to get started. Katie, it's over to you.
Thanks, Barbara. I'm excited to share what I know about creating trauma-sensitive classrooms today. So here's an overview of what I will be talking about. First, I'll be defining trauma so that we're all starting out on the same page. Next, I'm going to look at the prevalence of trauma in the United States and how often children between birth to 8 have traumatic experiences. And after this, I want to share a little bit about the ways that trauma can impact children's attachment process and brain development before I jump into discussing what trauma can look like in the classroom. And after we have a good sense of the ways that trauma impacts children, I'll be offering some strategies and interventions that can be used to create trauma-sensitive classrooms. And lastly, like Barbara said, I'll be answering any lingering questions you may have concerning the information that I'm sharing. So to begin, I really wanted to offer you a definition of trauma. There are a lot of different definitions out there, but I think that this one is really comprehensive. So it states that trauma is often the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds one's ability to cope or integrate the emotions involved in that experience. So trauma differs among individuals by their subjective experiences, not the objective facts. So what I think is so key here is that the definition is saying that that trauma is not uniform among those who experience it. So two people could experience the same traumatic event, but have very different responses to the trauma. So there are also two different types of trauma that we can talk about here. So there's acute trauma and complex trauma. Acute trauma is a traumatic event that happens one time. It includes things like a car accident, a theft, or witnessing a violent event. And a complex trauma, on the other hand, is a repetitive trauma that occurs during childhood. And complex trauma is persistent, it's unpredictable, and it's often episodic. So complex trauma usually occurs within intimate relationships, and it includes things like emotional abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and witnessing domestic violence. So here's a list of some of the traumas that the children we care for in our classrooms may experience. So early loss or lack of consistent caregivers. So this may include children who are in foster care or who are adopted, children whose parents are divorced, or when one parent is incarcerated. Emotional, physical, and sexual abuse are usually what come to mind when we think about trauma. So it includes things like name calling, physically hurting children, or inappropriate touches. Domestic violence can also be really traumatic for children. Seeing and hearing the violence, even though they're not actually a part of it, can be really overwhelming. Neglect is actually one of the most harmful forms of trauma, and it's sometimes the hardest form of trauma to identify. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about building healthy attachments. And then other traumas include things like war, medical and surgical procedures, and serious accidents. Spending a lot of time in the hospital as a young child can cause a trauma response for some children. So trauma is often not discussed. The rates of trauma can be quite surprising. In the US, 40% of children will experience at least one traumatizing event before the age of 18. In 2016, there was an estimated 676,000 children in the U.S. who were survivors of child abuse and neglect, and more than half of these trauma survivors were between birth and 8. And children under the age of 1 were the most vulnerable to experiencing trauma. And the majority perpetrated by the children's own parents. So trauma happens across all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups, and trauma isn't something that is group or community specific. However, young children of color and children living in poverty are grossly overrepresented in foster care and the child welfare system. So as mandatory reporters, we really need to acknowledge this inequity and critically think about what we consider atypical behavior for both children and their families. While all of us who work with young children will undoubtedly know children who've experienced trauma throughout our careers, to really successfully serve all children, we must be able to separate out expressions of trauma in the classroom from typical behaviors that may be culturally different from our own experiences. So now that we know that we will encounter young children who've experienced trauma in the classroom, I wanted to share some of the foundational research on early trauma. Most of what we know about early trauma started with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which was a joint study done between the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Kaiser Permanente between 1995 and 1997. And they included more than 17,000 adults who were all insured through Kaiser. So this study revealed that early adverse experiences, or these early traumas that we can call ACEs, are far more widespread than formerly believed, and experiencing ACEs is strongly connected with negative health and behavioral outcomes in adulthood. So this study defined 10 different ACEs, which you can see along with their prevalence on this slide. And to find out how many people experience ACEs, they asked participants directly if they had experienced each ACE. So it was a simple yes or no questionnaire. And what they found was that many participants had experienced ACEs. So for example, you can see on the slide that 27% of participants said that they grew up with substance abuse in their home, and 23% said they grew up with parental separation or divorce. So over the 17,000 people they studied, almost 2/3 of the study participants had experienced at least one ACE, and more than 1 in 5 had experienced 3 or more ACEs. And what's really interesting about this study is that they found that there was a clear dose response to ACEs. So the more ACEs someone experienced, the higher the likelihood of having physical or mental health issues as adults. So they found that childhood traumas are predictive of a whole host of mental and physical health issues, like early introduction to alcohol use and continued problem drinking, depression, sleep disturbances, suicidality, anxiety disorders. And then they also found that ACEs are more likely to lead to things like liver disease, cancer, diabetes, stroke, and heart disease. So this ACE pyramid here represents the conceptual framework for the study. So the ACE study takes a whole life perspective, and you can see on the left-hand side the arrow that is showing this sort of idea of conception through death. So the ACE study really began to show us how adverse childhood experiences are strongly related to development. So children who experience adversity are more likely to experience disrupted neurodevelopment, which leads to developmental impairments, which then leads to participating in health risk behaviors like smoking, drinking, doing drugs. And these risky behaviors lead to a higher likelihood of experiencing diseases and social problems, which eventually and unfortunately leads to early death. So on a whole life scale, clearly ACEs are not something that we can ignore if we want to support our children's healthy development. So while the ACE study offered us a clear and profound link between early experiences of trauma and later health issues, it didn't really identify the immediate effects of trauma on children themselves, but the ACE study really got all of that research started. So since that time, a lot of study has been done on this, and there was a 2014 study of 3 to 4-year-old children that were attending a federally funded Head Start program, and they found that children's ACE exposure was associated with lower teacher ratings of social, emotional, cognitive, language, literacy, and math development. And of course, when I see any study that's really focusing on teacher rating, I kind of want to question that, because I know that as teachers, we come in with our own experiences and our own biases, but this research has really been shown over and over again through different studies. So these findings that ACEs increase social, emotional, and academic challenges hold true for the elementary years as well. So a 2011 study looking at students ages 5 to 11 found that 45% of the students experienced 1 or more ACEs, and 6% of students experienced 4 or more ACEs. So this study found that just as ACEs have a dose response for adults, they also have a dose response for students as well, which means that the more ACEs the students experience, the more likely it was that there would be negative academic and social outcomes. So for example, compared to their peers with 0 ACEs, a student with 1 ACE was 1.5 times more likely to experience academic concerns. Students with 2 ACEs were 2.5 times as likely to have academic concerns, and students with 3 or more ACEs were 2.9 times more likely to have academic concerns. And then as you can see in this graph, the findings of the study demonstrate that students who experienced more ACEs were also more likely to have behavioral concerns, attendance concerns, or health concerns. So when we think about trauma, I think it's really important for us to first think about attachment, because children learn about the world and about themselves through their relationships with their primary caregivers. So this attachment relationship takes place through what's called a serve and return interaction between babies and their caregivers. So this serve and return forms the connections that build children's early sense of self and their brain architecture. So children learn to regulate their emotions and behaviors by expressing their wants and needs, this serve, and learning how their caregivers respond to them, which is the return. So the ways their primary caregivers interact with them affect how children see themselves and the world around them. So when babies send out this serve, when they send out a cry or a smile, a babble or a laugh, and their adults respond appropriately, and appropriately is of course culturally bound, but it can include things like words, facial expressions, eye contact. Babies are learning that when they express a need, good things happen to and for them. So they learn through these interactions how to trust, They trust that when they have a need, there's someone there to help them, and they learn they're worthy of that help, that their needs matter. So most of the early attachment research was done on white middle-class families, but the more recent attachment research has really demonstrated that the concept of the serve and return is consistent across racial, cultural, and ethnic groups. So there are a lot of different ways to complete the serve and return interaction, and there isn't one that's better than another. But for children who are living in chaotic or fearful environments, especially when their caregivers are the source of that fear, they may not be receiving this healthy serve and return relationship. So they can end up feeling hopeless and out of control. So when they cry, they may not have anyone who comes to them. Or sometimes they may have someone who comes to them who's calm and loving, but sometimes that same person may be angry and scary. So they're not learning to trust, and they're not learning that their needs matter. Instead, what they're learning is that their world is unsafe, threatening, or unpredictable. And that's a really scary way to feel as you move from being a baby to a toddler to a preschooler when you're supposed to be ready and primed for exploration. So children who do not experience a healthy early attachment relationship and are living in environments that are unpredictable and scary can have negative impacts on their brain development as well. So there's a lot of different ways of thinking about the brain, but we can think of the brain as having two different parts, the thinking brain and the feeling brain. And typically, young children are really living in their feeling brain. They're having needs, and then they're having those needs met, and they're expressing those needs through their feelings. And through this interaction, they're learning how to regulate their emotions, and that helps them move into the thinking brain. But for children who don't have these healthy early attachment relationships and they're living in fear and stress, they may have a heightened stress response, which leaves them stuck in their emotional brains. So their biological instinct to fight, flee, or freeze is constantly being activated, even when there's nothing scary happening. So they're constantly focusing on protecting themselves and keeping themselves emotionally and physically safe. So what happens is the feeling brain gets used over and over and over again, and it becomes really well developed, which leaves less time and activation for the thinking brain, which can, of course, cause huge problems for them in a dynamic and stimulating classroom environment where there's a lot going on. So in the classroom, young children who've experienced trauma may be triggered by small events that cause them to have big reactions. It's as if there's a current threat happening, even when there actually is not a threat there. So they may see, hear, feel, or smell something that reminds them of their past trauma. And what happens is it's as if there's a current physical or emotional threat, and so their thinking brain completely shuts down as they work to protect themselves. So this is really important for us to be aware of, because oftentimes when we have children who are being triggered by events that we cannot see or notice, we begin to define their behavior as the problem. So rather than trying to understand and respond to the underlying cause, which we don't really understand in the moment, we're responding to their behavior. So we'll say things like, it seems like their behavior came out of nowhere, they show no remorse, they're being manipulative, but really what's happening is the child's brain is being flooded by the overwhelming stress response, and they're doing everything they can to keep themselves safe. So to give you an example of triggers in the classroom, I'm going to describe Susan, a 4-year-old who is attending preschool. So Susan lives with her mom and her dad and her 3 brothers. And at home, her dad is pretty verbally abusive, and there's physical fighting between her parents multiple times a week. And just recently, her mom hit her so hard that she left a bruise on her bottom, but Susan didn't tell anyone about it. And the fighting between her parents has been going on long before Susan was even born. And so often when Susan was a baby, she would be left on her own for hours at a time as her parents fought. So she could hear them, but it seemed like no one could really hear her. So Susan really loves school, and she's always happy to come. It's typically a calmer environment than home, and she loves having her friends there, and she loves her teachers. And one morning, she's playing in the block corner with a friend, and they're working on building a tower. And so they get the tower quite high, and Susan goes and grabs a chair, brings it over, stands on the chair to place the last block on the top of this tower. And as she does, the whole thing comes crashing down. So everyone in the classroom can hear this crash. And both of the children, Susan and her friend, both start laughing. And immediately they decide they're going to rebuild their tower. So they start working on it again. But this time, as Susan is working, she starts to kind of lean into her friend, which kind of moves into pushing her friend. And she has a lot of opinions about where the blocks need to go. And she's telling her friend how to put the blocks onto the tower. And at one point, she gets so frustrated, she leans over and she bites her friend's arm. So this may look like it's coming out of nowhere to her teachers and her peers. She appeared fine one moment until her behavior suddenly changed. But really what's happening is that she's triggered by the loud noise that she hears in the classroom, even though she was there for it and she was the one who made it happen. So her body became overwhelmed by the stress and fear of the crash, and now she's dealing with the effects of the stress response. So Susan's triggers not only bring about behavioral changes, but living in a constant state of fear and stress can also have long-term effects on Susan and other children's cognitive development. So children who experience overwhelming stress can have troubles with memory, problem solving, reasoning, thinking through concepts, and understanding cause and effect. And they may struggle to learn new skills or to take in new information. They can also have difficulty focusing, which is why they are often misdiagnosed as having ADHD, when really what they're experiencing is hypervigilance. So all of these cognitive challenges can make typical behavior management strategies completely ineffective and really frustrating for teachers because they often require that children have typical cognitive skills, which they may just not have. So they may not have the memory skills or the cause and effect, the memory or the cause and effect understanding that they need in order to be successful with what we use in terms of typical behavior management strategies often in the classroom. So like all development, language acquisition occurs through relationships. So it's through these interactions that children learn how language is used on a social level. So children who experience trauma may not have the healthy and consistent caregiving they need to learn important pre-verbal or verbal language skills, which can cause delays or gaps in their communication. So for babies, this may look like not cooing or babbling when we expect them to. They may be really shut down and unresponsive and not really able to focus on their caregiver's face. And then for toddlers, preschoolers, and early elementary age children, they may not have the receptive or expressive language skills they need to communicate effectively with their peers, and they may need extra processing time to make sense of what's said to them. So they may really need you to slow way down so they can understand what you're saying. And when children are heightened and overwhelmed, they definitely can't process a lot of words coming at them, and so usually they can process about 5-word statements. So you need to be succinct and to the point for them to be able to hear you. So children who live in environments that are built on control are often exposed to instrumental language, things like sit down, come here, be quiet, versus expressive language, which you need to share feelings, to negotiate, or problem solve. So as children get older, we expect them to have the skills to be able to communicate with each other more and more. We expect them to move beyond hitting or yelling to get what they want. But for children who are living in stress, they may need lots and lots of practice using this healthy expressive language because they're not getting it at home as well. So children with limited language skills may use the negative tactics that are used in their home to try to build relationships, which can be frustrating for them when they don't work. So I'm going to give you the example of Leon. So I was once asked to consult with teachers who were struggling with this 5-year-old named Leon, who was having big behaviors, and he was having trouble building relationships in the classroom. So I observed him as he built this really intricate ship out of Legos, and then I watched as he walked around the classroom, moving from child to child, saying, I bet you can't build a ship like this. And each child just looked at him with this annoyed voice or face or a confused face, and then they just turned away. They didn't really know how to respond to him. And after a few tries, I walked over to him and said, Leon, are you wanting to play with your friends? And he enthusiastically looked at me and responded, yeah. And I said, why don't you say, do you want to play with me? And then he went off and he tried it, and it worked. And he was able to find a way to break into the play. But at first glance, his behavior could have been misconstrued as simply mean or competitive instead of what it really was, which was this desire for connection using the only language that he knew. So perhaps most importantly, social emotional development can be significantly impacted by early trauma. So in babies, we may see them having a really hard time being soothed, lots of crying. They may be arching away from their caregivers. They may not want to be touched or held, or they may want to be close all the time and have a really hard time being put down. And then in toddlers, preschoolers, and elementary age children, we may see kids who either don't want to move away from their teachers at all in the classroom, they always want to be close, or children who rarely want comfort and try to always care for themselves. And all of these children may express their feelings through big behaviors. So behaviors towards themselves or towards others. So things like slapping themselves in the face, banging their head on the ground, kicking, hitting, biting, screaming, and crying. Because children coming from hard places often distrust that others will be predictable, they feel like they need to keep themselves safe by being distant and not creating close relationships with their peers and teachers, which is absolutely counterproductive for children who really need that connection. They may also try to control the classroom environment because since their lives feel so out of control, they're trying to take control wherever they can find it. So you might find kids who are very demanding or inflexible. And children who have experienced early trauma, and especially children who have experienced early neglect, may lie or steal to get what they want or to get out of getting in trouble. So we can literally find a child covered head to toe in paint, and that child may still look at us and earnestly say, nope, I didn't take out the paint. Now, even if we're not upset about this, they may be convinced that we will be. And in that moment, they are doing absolutely everything they can to keep themselves safe. And it's our job to show them that they are safe rather than just simply punishing the behavior. So when I see a child who's lying or stealing, I try to move beyond those labels and their behaviors to understand the underlying need. And we'll talk about that more as we continue on. Children who've experienced trauma may be fearful of exploring and trying new things because they may not know if the world is safe or if there will be someone who's there for them when they have a hard time. So this can really hinder their curiosity and interrupt their play. So for babies, this may look like very little movement, little interest in toys. They may not interact with adults or other babies, and they may look sullen or listless. And for toddlers, this may look like erratic and purposeless play, so picking up objects, quickly dropping them, moving around and kind of watching other children for short bits before moving on to different activities. And although toddlers typically do have short attention spans, their play is usually purposeful. And it's very different for toddlers who've experienced trauma, who sometimes their play can seem really frenetic. It's as if they're in constant motion without really moving anywhere or to anything. So children in preschool and early elementary school can also have difficulties in play. They may have a hard time concentrating, negotiating, problem solving, and moving into imaginative play worlds. Because in order to move into imaginative play, you have to feel safe enough in your environment that you don't feel like you have to constantly scan the environment to make sure that you're safe. They may also prefer to play with younger children because then they can control the play, or because emotionally they just are younger and so they connect more with younger kids. And sometimes children who've experienced trauma can get stuck replaying the triggering experience over and over again, and they may need an adult to support them to think of alternate endings or other play experiences they can have. So children who've experienced trauma may have both fine and gross motor delays, and as they get older, they may have somatic symptoms, things like headaches or stomach aches, or great amounts of pain for what seem to us like minor scrapes or falls. So we have to remember that for them, that tiny scrape does feel like a big, big deal. And children who come from hard places can also have sensory challenges in the classroom. They may be sensitive to noise and touch or hardly seem to notice these things, and they themselves may be really loud and pretty rough with their friends without meaning to be. And frequently, it's difficult for children who've experienced trauma to fall asleep or to stay asleep. And this can be because scary stuff has happened around nap or bedtime, but it can also be because their bodies are just having a hard time settling down and calming because they're constantly scanning the environment to keep themselves safe. And once they are asleep, they can have a hard time waking up because when they're living with such stress and fear, when they do fall asleep, they fall into a very, very heavy, deep sleep. And the last thing that we see in the classroom that I really wanted to talk about was dissociation. So children who've experienced early trauma may also have a hard time listening and concentrating in class because they're just shutting down, they're freezing. And this can look like daydreaming. So often when I hear teachers talk about how they have a student in their class who just spends their time daydreaming, and if they could just focus on their work a little bit more, they would be doing so well. I always like to think about, is this a trauma symptom? Are there things underlying this behavior that's causing this to happen in the classroom? So now that we know that trauma can impact the brain in all developmental domains, it's important for us to ask, what can we do in the classroom? And luckily for us, the brain has an amazing ability to rewire, change, and reorganize in response to new experiences. And this ability is called neuroplasticity. So amazingly, just as young children's brains can change based on traumatic or stressful environments, they're also able to change again when they're exposed to supportive environments. So neuroplasticity is especially prevalent in young children because this is when their brains are developing the fastest, which is why early childhood is such a critical period for appropriate trauma-sensitive environments, and it's why the role of the educator is so very important. So to create trauma-sensitive classroom environments, we must understand the prevalence of trauma, and we also need to understand how the behaviors and trauma symptoms we're seeing are adaptive behaviors that children have learned to keep themselves safe. If we are focused on being angry or frustrated by the behaviors themselves, we're missing out on understanding what children are communicating to us through their behaviors and their symptoms. So it's our job to offer healthy, reparative experiences to support children in learning new ways of feeling and being. So I'm going to go over in detail some of the ways you can support children who've experienced trauma, and you're going to notice as I talk that most of the suggestions I offer are relationship-based. As I've discussed, children need to feel safe and connected before their behavior can change. So these relationship-based interventions offer the foundational skills young children need to learn that they matter, they have an impact on the world, and that they are capable of gaining the skills they need to succeed. So these suggestions are not quick fixes, even though you may see some significant changes right away, but really these are long-term techniques that take time, patience, and understanding. So before everything else, we really need to first find strengths in the children we work with. Oftentimes, when I'm consulting with educators, I can see how easy it is to get caught up in the challenges. the children are experiencing and the challenges that educators are having caring for children. So we forget to see the highly adaptive and often extremely creative behaviors the children are demonstrating. So when I sit down to work with teachers who are struggling with a child, the first thing I want to know is, what does that child do well? I want to know what teachers love about the child, where and how are they able to connect, what do they find inspiring about the child, because from there, we can find ways to build on their strengths. To support children in learning that the world can be safe and predictable, we need to create classroom environments that are built on mutual respect and belonging. We need to share power in the classroom and allow for child voice and celebrate child voice. And one of the things that's most important in creating this respectful environment is being culturally responsive and aware. So we need to deeply know our children and their families and the different expectations that they may have in their home and in their communities. The children we work with need to be represented in the classroom so they can build a sense of belonging. We can communicate to them through both our words and our environment that they're visible and that they matter. Another way to support children is by creating safety through a very consistent and clear daily rhythm. Children can learn what to expect each time they're at school, and this can shut down some of that hypervigilance. And if there are changes to the rhythm, children may need lots of warning before it happens. So supporting them during changes in the classroom happens through talking about it before it happens, discussing it while it happens, and then processing it afterwards. Because as I talked about when discussing cognitive development, they may not have the skills to put what happened in sequential order or to remember all the details, but you can help them remember the experience. So rather than focusing on punishments and ways to stop behavior, we need to focus on the underlying needs of our students. We have to remember that the children in our classrooms may not have the cognitive skills or language to ask to take turns instead of grab, or problem solve instead of hit. So they need support in learning these skills rather than punishments for doing it wrong. So rather than punishing, I like to offer do-overs where they get to practice these skills. So offer the language they need to interact appropriately rather than just shutting down the inappropriate language you hear. So this doesn't mean that all behavior is allowed and acceptable, but it does mean that we're focusing on skill building. So let's take Leon, for example, who I talked about earlier with his Lego ship. So rather than going over and telling him his behavior wasn't nice or it was mean because he was telling other children they couldn't build ships that were as good as his, I looked for the underlying need or want. What was he needing? What was he wanting in that moment? And what he was really wanting was connection. And so I offered him the language he needed to make that connection with his peers. And after working with Leon for several months, as we observed, documented, and built a proactive plan around his classroom behavior, I can tell you that he needed many, many reminders and supports to practice healthy connection making. But through it all, he grew and he changed as he began to realize that his classroom environment was safe and that his peers wanted to befriend him. To support children in feeling like their voices matter, we need to create proactive rather than reactive classroom environments that focus on building children's social-emotional capacities. And there are so many different ways that we can do this. But it's our job to find ways to teach them self-regulation skills. So there are things like mindfulness and breathing techniques that can be really helpful. We can talk to the children about what they can do if they start to have big feelings, if they start to feel mad or angry or upset or sad or worried. we can discuss strategies that they can use to stay calm. And many children don't have the capacity to recognize and name their own feelings or the feelings of others. And so when they see feelings in others, they immediately feel like it's a threat, and maybe it's a feeling of anger. So when I'm working with children who are having a hard time staying calm in the classroom, I want to begin to build the basic language and facial cues that go with different emotions. So this can be done through photos, books, games, and often it can be really fun to make different emotion faces using the students in your classroom, because that way you're building their emotion vocabulary while also building community. And sometimes for children who have experienced trauma, like we talked about with the sensory stuff, the classroom environment can feel really overwhelming. And so creating a calming space where they can go can be really helpful. So this calming space is a space where they can go by themselves or with you or with a peer to calm down. So I never use this space as a punishment. It's a space where they can go if they want to. So it's a comfort for them. I never use isolation, things like timeouts, as a strategy for children who've experienced trauma, because children who have a hard time regulating need an adult to co-regulate with them. And so cutting them off from connection really does the opposite of what we're hoping for. A lot of children who've experienced trauma may not have opportunities to express their wants and their needs and their interests in their home. So they may need lots of opportunities to share power in the classroom. So offering them choices can help them feel like they have some control over their lives. So I don't want to get into a power struggle with a child over small tasks. Instead, I want to find solutions with them that can meet both of our needs. So I'm also not going to offer them extremely large choices, like deciding if the entire class is going to go outside for recess or stay in to play board games. Instead, I'm going to offer them small, manageable choices, like their socks got wet playing outside. Would they rather put on red socks or blue socks? I think it's also really important that we're holding all of the children we work with to high expectations. So just because I'm offering choices does not mean that I'm excusing them from participating fully in the classroom community and that I'm excusing behavior. But if we believe in them, they will learn to believe in themselves. To show the children who have had unpredictable or inconsistent early lives that our classrooms are different, we need to always be working on connection rather than focusing on correction. So we can use non-judgmental language to explore why children are expressing big feelings or behaviors. So I want to avoid using language like, you're being sneaky right now, and instead say something like, I see you're leaving the table with Jennifer's cookie. So I can be curious, I can kind of state what I'm seeing happen without being judgmental. And this can help me learn more about their fears, their needs, and their wants, which can help us in creating this proactive classroom community that we're trying to create. To best support young children, we need to connect with families. Our children's families are our partners and our best allies. We need to respect them and believe in them, and we need to build rapport and connection with families if we're asking for their help understanding their children and their children's behavior in the classroom. Parents love their children. All parents love their children. So whether they've made mistakes in the past or not, it's truly counterproductive for us to spend our time judging and shaming families for the choices that they've made, because we need to be working with them. And then when we're stuck or we're having challenges, we need to be self-reflective and ask for support from colleagues. We need to bounce ideas off of others and learn through their experiences. And if that only gets us so far, we also need to turn to outside resources such as books and articles. And the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a whole host of resources that you can look into. And then we also need to connect to mental health and other early childhood professionals. So people like occupational therapists, physical therapists, and speech pathologists can have great insight into specific developmental domains that we may not have. Working with children who've experienced trauma can feel overwhelming, and it can trigger one's own experience of trauma as well. So self-care is vitally important if we want to be able to remain emotionally available and calm with the children in our classrooms. And self-care is something that's really different for everyone. So you will have to figure out what works for you. Do you like to take walks? Do you meditate? Do you get massages? Do you get your nails done? Whatever it is, we all have to hold ourselves accountable to doing these self-care activities so that we don't burn out. Because our community's children really do need educators who are and want to be trauma sensitive. And lastly, to be trauma sensitive educators, we must understand that what we're dealing with are neurodevelopmental changes, and that it's our job to stay calm and supportive. We must see the children themselves rather than just seeing their behaviors. And we must trust that we can and we will support young children in moving through and learning to cope with some of the challenges that they express in the classroom. And importantly, we must truly believe that the way to do this is through relationship. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you all. And at this point, I welcome any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Katie, for a great presentation. There's some interesting questions that have been posed. One says, one child in my classroom, 4 years old, is exhibiting aggressive behaviors toward peers, such as hitting, pushing, biting. When we talk to him about being nice to his friends, he'll say, they're not my friends. We work hard to help him make friends with his peers, and also he says, I'm not a hero, I'm a villain. How would you respond to these comments?
Yeah, so it sounds like this child is having a hard time with self-esteem. And so I think the first thing that I would really focus on is building his self-esteem. So when I was talking about the strengths, what are the strengths that he has in the classroom? So how can he feel good about himself? Because right now it sounds like he doesn't even feel like he can have friends, that he can have relationships, and that he's worthy of that. So I would try to find ways to build him up, to make him feel good about himself. And then from there, he can start to enter into relationships with others.
Okay, another question, is trauma in children commonly misdiagnosed?
Well, is it misdiagnosed? Maybe just to clarify, I'm seeing this question as, is it misdiagnosed as other issues? Oftentimes, children who've experienced trauma are diagnosed with things like ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, lots of other sort of surrounding things that are really getting to the behaviors and the symptoms of the trauma rather than just the trauma itself. And sometimes this is done because that's the way to get supports. That's the way to get support in the classroom through the school district. And sometimes it's done because there's just a lack of knowledge of what trauma looks like in children.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned not addressing the behaviors or acting out, but focusing on the underlying fears of the child. Can you speak to this or to this kind of encounter? I have a student who acts out when he suspects fear or the unknown, but I often find myself just pacifying him for the moment. I really want to formulate more solid solutions or phrases to help him.
Okay. Yeah, so when I'm thinking about children who have really big behaviors, I want to think about what are the things that I can create in my classroom to proactively stop those feelings, those overwhelming feelings before they happen. So we want to catch those feelings before they become so overwhelming that they are these big behaviors, right? So to me, that involves a lot of observing, a lot of documenting the behaviors that I'm seeing, and finding ways to kind of get in there to support them before it happens. And this can happen through social stories. You can discuss the issue. You can look at books. You can play the experience with the child. You can act out what can happen, but you want to find ways that they can feel calm in the classroom as much as possible, because the more they feel calm, the more they're going to have that experience in their brains of, oh, I can feel calm in this space, and I can play with my friends, and I can imagine different scenarios, and I can be curious, and I can go do art, and all of those different really important skills for them to learn.
Okay. Next question is, don't children need to learn to self-soothe just like everyone else?
That's a really great question. Yes, children do need to self-soothe, but what's really, I think, interesting about self-soothing is that self-soothing is learned through soothing with another person, right? So we learn to regulate ourselves, and we learn how to come through big feelings by first having that experience with another person. We can't learn that on our own, because just the same way that we don't ask teeny tiny babies to learn how to feel better on their own, we come to them, right? Over and over and over again, we're coming to them when they have these feelings and these needs. For children who haven't received that when they were really little, they need all of that understanding over and over and over again. And when we think about tiny babies, we are coming to them so many times in just one day, right? They need bottles or to be nursed. They need their diaper changed. They need to be held. They need to be rocked. This is kind of constant when they're teeny tiny. And if they haven't gotten that, then they're missing all of those interactions. So we need to sort of build back up for them all of that experience of having someone meet their needs over and over again and helping them regulate before we're expecting that they can do that on their own. And they will be able to get there, but you can't really skip over that serve and return relationship without first really working on it together.
Okay, and there's one quick question from my friend Jeannie Forrest. She's asking if there will be a resource list at the end of the presentation that will be available.
I don't have a resource list to send out. I mentioned during the presentation the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They are a really great resource to go to. And Barbara, I know you wrote a really fantastic book about working with young children who've experienced trauma in the classroom. And then also anyone can feel free to email me with other questions.
Okay. Probably this may be our last question. How does trauma-affected behavior differ from behavior of children who have had fetal alcohol or fetal drug effects?
That's a really great question. Oftentimes, these behaviors can look very, very similar. One thing about fetal alcohol, it can sort of, there can be developmental delays and concerns in sort of similar ways. And sometimes for children who have fetal alcohol effect, they have some days that are really, really great, and it doesn't seem like there are issues, sort of all of the connections are happening. And then other days there can be large, large gaps. So that's one thing that can sometimes look a little bit different. And oftentimes, especially for children who are coming into the foster care system, there may be an overlap. There may be trauma, and there also may be fetal alcohol stuff going on, and we just don't know. So we kind of have to approach it from the best way that it seems to meet that child's needs.
Okay. We'll squeeze another one in. I am thinking of a child in my room who was often aggressive. It was very difficult to refrain from putting hands on this child in order to keep other children safe. I realized that this could be triggering. Ideas on this, how to deal with constant aggression in the moment.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So again, I go back to, can we observe, can we document what's happening for this child before the aggressive behavior begins to try to stop it? And then if it does happen, can we have a plan in place for what we do? So it may be that we move some of the other children away from that child so that child can have this space. I really appreciate that you're thinking about what would happen for that child if you are putting your hands on them, because that can be super triggering, and oftentimes it can really be counterproductive, right? So we want to be able to create a space for them where they can be really upset and we can be there for them while also not getting ourselves in the way of being hurt. So sometimes what I'll do in the classroom, if I have a child who's really upset and they're hitting and they're kicking, I'll just move, a chair in between us so that I can kind of stay calm, I can stay present, but I can also give myself a little bit of space between them. Other things are just really making sure that you're wearing clothing that can work with a child like this, right? So making sure that you can move quickly and easily. Sometimes I've worked with teachers who they know that the first thing that a student does is kind of reach out and pinch them if they're feeling upset. So they started wearing long sleeve shirts to work for the couple of months that we were dealing with this, just to sort of be proactive in every way that they could as they were working on de-escalating these behaviors.
Well, thank you so much. You gave some great answers to these questions. As you see on the screen, this is the information about the Professional Learning Institute. We hope that we will see you there.
Thank you.